Hi, thanks for joining us for episode number 90 of the Doctor Podcast Cykiert File Show. We really appreciate you tuning in, and please subscribe and follow Doctor Podcasts. And we also would greatly appreciate it if you could like and share and repost this episode. The more likes and shares and reposts we get, the more fantastic guests we get, like we have today. Today, we're going to discuss two very important topics that are occasionally in the media, but in my opinion, do not get enough attention. And so we have one of the world's top experts on both of these subjects. And the subjects are tuberculosis and also coughs and chronic coughs. And our expert today is Dr. Peter Small. Dr. Small is board certified in internal medicine and also in infectious diseases. He's one of the world's top experts on tuberculosis and TB for many decades. He built and ran the TB or tuberculosis program for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which we'll talk about. And in 2015, he founded the Global Health Institute at Stony Brook University, which is in Long Island, New York, where he focused on the use of technology to deliver healthcare in remote Madagascar and Nepal. And he's been all over the world studying these diseases. Currently, Dr. Small is the Chief Medical Officer of the Hive Company, which we'll talk about with regards to coughs. So, Peter, thanks very much for taking the time from your busy day to join us today and to educate us about these two very important topics.
Thanks, Robert, for having me on your podcast.
All right. It's great. Thanks. We appreciate you coming. So let's talk about tuberculosis first. Can you tell us what tuberculosis or TB is and what causes it?
Yeah, it's funny. It's a largely forgotten disease in rich countries, and yet it's the leading infectious killer of mankind. It's an airborne bacterial disease with a very high mortality when it's untreated, but is entirely curable with antibiotics when it's diagnosed and treated appropriately. So a really important disease in terms of its impact, and an interesting disease in terms of the intersection between public health and disease burden.
Right. Now, I looked at the CDC and the WHO, World Health Organization website, and in 2021, over 2.5 million people died from tuberculosis in the entire planet, which makes it the leading killer other than COVID. COVID was a pandemic, but tuberculosis has been around a long time. How come we don't hear that much about tuberculosis, even though it's been killing several million people a year for many years?
Well, you're entirely correct in terms of the magnitude of the problem. In fact, it's hard to wrap your mind around the magnitude of the global tuberculosis situation. There over 3,500 people die every day from tuberculosis. There are roughly 10 million new cases each year. And each of those cases, if not promptly diagnosed and treated, will infect 20 others. So you're right, it's massive. And actually, in the last few years, its resurgence in the context of COVID has surpassed COVID as the leading infectious disease killer. And I have to say, the reason we don't hear about it is all about how we define us versus them. It's not a disease of you and I, right? There are, fewer than 10,000 cases in the United States, fairly rare. But globally, like 1 in 4 people are infected with this germ. And so, but the people who are affected by tuberculosis tend to be the poor and the underrepresented. About 85% of TB cases in the world happen in 30 countries, that largely low and middle income countries.
So it's a matter of socioeconomics again.
I think its epidemiology is socioeconomic. I think the antiquated and inadequate tools that we've been using to combat it are largely a consequence of economics. And it's just, if you are investing in a new diagnostic drug or vaccine, you're not going to focus on a market, while massive, but where most of those people are earning $2 a day. And so, once after like the 50s, 60s, when tuberculosis became less of a problem in the United States, attention shifted elsewhere. And in fact, as recently as the 1990s, the entire US NIH budget on developing better tools was less than $2 million.
Wow.
So it was definitely a disease that affected them, and we started to ignore.
Right. Now, even though there are about 10,000 cases a year in the USA, I understand that there could be about 10 million carriers of tuberculosis in the USA because there's both an active and an inactive form of the disease. Can you tell us about that?
I can. I mean, I've been fighting this germ my entire life professionally, and it's a wily foe. And in particular, the way it works is that when someone gets sick with it, they have pneumonia, it creates a cavity in their lung, which it's like a perfume bottle. You blow air over that cavity and it just aerosolizes all the phlegm, which has got like tens of thousands of bacteria per milliliter. So what happens is someone who has the disease is highly infectious. And then that stays suspended in the air like the smoke in LA right now for as long as a day. And anyone who inhales one of those germs will get infected. And when they get infected, some of them will clear the bacteria, but many people don't. And they get this latent infection. The germ just kind of hunkers down. It doesn't make them sick. It just sits there. And that's called latent tuberculosis. And about 1 in 4 people in the world, about 13 million people in the United States, have this latent infection. Wow. And 5 to 10% of them over the course of their life will have some event. They'll either get old and their immune system fails, or they'll be given some immunosuppressing drugs, or just bad luck. We don't know. Then the bacteria wakes up. It's like a sleeper cell of some kind of terrorist organization. And then it reactivates. It causes this disease. It basically calls in the immune system, says, hey, I'm here, create a big cavity so that I can be spread to the next person. It's an incredible thing. But from a clinical perspective, we do think of TB as occurring in this latent, non-infectious, asymptomatic, and we can only detect them with a blood test or with a skin test that many people have had. And the active condition, which is the real heart of the game, those are the people who have active disease. They're spreading it to others. We have to find and treat them properly, or the disease propagates.
Right. And it is very contagious if you're coughing.
It is. I mean, it's like COVID. It's an airborne infection, and those are the hardest to confront because there's no behavior short of breathing and coughing that you can modify, and it's just, if someone has TB, they're breathing, they're speaking, they're coughing, they're singing in a choir. All of that, just like COVID, spreads the pathogen.
Right. And why is it not tested more frequently? You mentioned there's a blood test for it and a skin test, and most people never have those tests. Why is that?
Yeah, the tests are, the old test, which was the skin test, was hard to interpret. You probably remember from medical school, like, oh, if they're at high risk, greater than 5 milliliters. If they're low risk, 5, it was a mess. Now there's a really good blood test that just says, like, this person's infected or not. The problem is that identifying someone as infected only indicates that they're at risk for this disease. And only 5 to 10% of them will progress to disease. And then it used to be like, oh, we got into this hard thing of like, oh, how do we treat latent infection? Is it like 9 months of isoniazid? And should we treat this person? But even
Right.
that has gotten so much better. So the short answer to why we don't test more people is because we're not practicing good medicine. People who have any risk of exposure to TB should know if they're infected. If they're
Right.
infected, they should get treated with incredibly simplified regimes that are now available.
Right. And those antibiotics get rid of the latent or inactive bacteria that are having a party in your lung.
Absolutely. You just like knock out the sleeper cells. You don't have to worry about, what happens when they get the call, the wake up call.
And the test is quantiferon gold you're referring to. Is that right?
I am. Yeah. It's huge advance in our field, I think, because before
Yeah.
that it was, basically using something that had been invented in the late 1800s, where you take dead bacteria, grind them up, put them in the skin. No, it's a major advance. I think we can now diagnose latent infection, and we can treat it very effectively with regimens that are easy to take and highly effective.
Right.
And the fact that we don't do that is just about, how complicated healthcare is.
Right. I know that to renew my hospital privileges, I used to have the TB skin test every 2 years, just to make sure. Now I do the simple blood test. And fortunately, it's negative all the time, but you never know. You could be on a subway or a bus, somebody coughs near you, and you can catch it, and you don't really know. Now,
Yeah.
there's, according to the CDC, there's an increased incidence of TB in the USA in the last few years. Is there an explanation why? Does it have anything to do with the increased migrants? Do we know?
I think we do know, and because we've seen it before. Tuberculosis is a very sensitive probe to the quality of your public health system. And our health system took a massive hit with the COVID epidemic. And therefore, more patients got immunosuppressed without being and developed symptoms without going to their doctor, without getting the appropriate health care, without getting diagnosed, and then they start infecting other people. So it's just that, and we saw this in the 1980s. There was this massive increase in TB associated with the HIV epidemic, and
Right.
and it was largely that the entire city of New York had 5,000 cases of TB, which was being managed by one part-time physician. I mean, that is not public health. That's ludicrousy. And that failure to stay on top of the disease cost billions of dollars of mopping up all the disease that was spread during that period where public health was poorly financed and poorly executed. So COVID, healthcare system takes a hit because of COVID. TB rates go up. It's just like, as day follows night.
Right. Sense. Now, just so people know out there, what symptoms should people think about, or if they have, they should get tested for TB?
Yeah. So the most common presentation of tuberculosis is pneumonia. So it's the symptoms of fever, cough, shortness of breath, chest pain, all those things you get with pneumonia. And with a little bit more of a propensity to have some hemoptysis. And
That's
that
coughing up blood.
coughing up blood. Yeah.
Right.
So all of that should make you think about TB. Now, another wily ploy on the side of the bacteria here is tuberculosis is an infectious disease running in molasses. Most bacteria double every 20 minutes, and TB doubles every 20 hours. So TB is a really slow onset disease, and people tend not to notice that they're a little short of breath or they're having a cough because it's kind of come on over 3 months. And in fact, often tuberculosis diagnosis is made in the context of a cancer workup. So, but the symptoms are pretty straightforward. Fever, cough, shortness of breath, coughing up blood, fatigue, weakness, all of those things. And that's the other thing is those are kind of like achy wakey stuff, right? We've
Right.
all
They're
felt that
not
way one day or
specific.
the next. Yeah.
Right.
So it's a difficult diagnosis, and in the United States, its difficulty is complicated by the fact that it's uncommon. 10,000, 9,000 cases is not a lot.
Right.
Having spent time working in other countries where they have a higher incidence of TB, it's a far better place to get diagnosed. You go into your doctor, they go like, "Oh, that sounds like TB," because they see it every day. And part of our challenge here is we don't see it every day. But
Right.
when we
So,
miss the diagnosis, and I did it myself as an intern very memorably, those people go out back and they are infecting other people.
the other problem is a lot of people who are treated don't stick with the treatment for the full 9 months, and so they're not really cured.
So this is another major challenge in the treatment of tuberculosis. It's an unusual and very sophisticated pathogen. And so it requires antibiotics that are not generally used. And you need multiple antibiotics, like we use multiple chemotherapeutic agents, and they have to be administered for a protracted period of time. And if they are not either prescribed right, which is quite common, or taken right, which is what we doctors like to say it's all about, then the bacteria can become resistant to those antibiotics. And for many years, tuberculosis that was drug resistant was a horrible diagnosis. You had to take 18 to 24 months of antibiotics, including daily injections for the first 6 to 12 months. And your survival was still only 50%. Yeah, so one of the hard things about tuberculosis is, like a cancer, you have to take multiple different drugs for a protracted period of time. And if you don't, then you can have the bacteria can become resistant to those drugs. And drug resistant TB 15 years ago, it was like you had to take 18 to 24 months of drugs, injectables for 6 to 12 months. It was horrible. And you only had a 50% survival rate. There is so much good news in TB. And I can't emphasize this enough, but we are really in an amazing period in terms of TB diagnosis, treatment, and prevention. And largely because 20 years ago, people like Bill Gates said, we need to invest in this. Why are we not investing in better cures? And the Wellcome Trust and the U.S. National Institutes of Health poured money into this, and they flipped the dynamic to a virtuous cycle where now we have 22 drugs that are, well, first of all, MDR-TB is curable with 6 months of pills. This is game changing for the 480,000 people every year who are diagnosed with this condition. And not only that, we know resistance will occur to these new drugs. It's that Red Queen thing. You got to keep running to stay in place. And so the cool thing is, because these organizations and our government and the World Health Organization remain focused on this issue and are bringing in resources and keeping scientists focused on it, we have 22 drugs that are in the pipeline that have not been put into human. We have 16 drugs that are already in clinical trials. So I'm super optimistic that this drug-resistant problem in TB is one that we've got a good handle on.
Sounds like the future might be promising. What was it like working with the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates? I think you were there over a decade, right?
Yeah, it was. I had the incredible privilege of being one of the early employees at the Gates Foundation Global Health Program, and I don't know, best job of my life. Imagine someone calls you up and said, how would you like to have the support of one of the richest couples in the world to take on one of the biggest public health challenges of the world? And all you have to do is demonstrate a return on their investment that's measured in life saved and not dollars earned. And have it your kind of the team that you're working with is just the most incredibly bright and motivated and skilled group I've ever been with. And I've worked in a lot of high functioning organizations. So no, that's fantastic. And I think that when it comes to global health, we will talk about the years before Bill and Melinda and the years after. And I am convinced that the Gates Foundation played a critical role in partnership with NIH and many other people, but in a catalytic way to create things like this molecular diagnostic, which is changing the game, this new drugs that are shortening therapy and curing drug resistance, and even some very interesting and promising work in vaccines that could prevent the disease. And, I just have to say, having had the incredible privilege of working directly with Bill and Melinda and seeing how they thought about and dug into these complicated questions was just super inspiring.
That's great. I hope they gave you some Microsoft stock.
No, and they didn't have to because I wasn't in it for that. I mean, okay, I would have taken it, but
Right.
no, I think it's amazing. I mean, like we're in this era where there are these techno oligarchs, and
Yeah.
they can choose to do what they want with their money. We are so fortunate that Bill and Melinda had the resources they did when they did to spend on global health and not, like yet a bigger yacht.
Right. Yeah. That's great. Good to hear that. So I want to talk about the next topic, which is cough or coughing, which is also a big problem, but also not discussed that much. Tell us about the importance of cough from a clinical public health perspective.
Yeah, Robert, just to start with my own personal connection with cough, and I spent 35 years as a tuberculosis nerd, and we spent our time trying to find people who were coughing and trying to get them tested for TB so they got diagnosed before they infected other people. At the same time, I myself have a refractory chronic cough. I cough 40 to 80 times a day, and I have for 3 decades.
Wow.
And so I got super excited about the potential of bringing new technology to cough, and was involved in the start of this company called Hive. And cough is a major issue which is largely underappreciated for individuals. Cough is critical. I mean, if you do not cough, you will die of aspiration pneumonia. And if you're coughing too much, you might be dying of pneumonia, right? And yet we can't quantify it.
Right.
Similarly, from a public health perspective, it's an early warning symptom. Like when everybody on the bus is coughing, there is something going on in that city. And at the same time, the fact that everyone's coughing on that bus means that they're spreading disease, and we need to react to it. So I just feel that cough is a largely underappreciated symptom, and part of that has been it's just like it's human nature. If you can't measure it, you don't pay attention to it.
Right. I have a personal relationship with cough also. I usually get like one bad cold or upper respiratory infection every year in the winter. And I always have a chronic 2 to 4 month cough afterwards that I just cannot get rid of. And it drives my family nuts and it drives me nuts. So it's a very big problem.
Super common, Robert. And the interesting thing about a post-viral cough is that it should get better. And that can be very slow. But if it doesn't, then you need to see a doctor because you might have a bacterial superinfection. You might be developing pneumonia. And yet, who knows? So, I myself, when I diagnosed myself with COVID, I called my doctor. I'm like, yeah, I'd like some Paxlovid. She was like, yeah, you're not at high risk. I'm like, yeah, but I have a cough. She's like, yeah, everyone's got a cough. I'm like, no, look at this. I'm coughing 471 times a day. She's like, writes the prescription. And then I saw it over the next 4 months, like your cough, it just slowly drifted down. And if I hadn't seen in month 2 that it was actually down to 200 and something coughs a day, I'd have been back in our office. But instead, I was like, okay, this is the usual stuff. It's going to take time. I'm getting better. So yeah, I think that that there's nobody who doesn't have a cough story.
Right. Now, cough is a significant problem. I read that about a quarter of global deaths are caused by respiratory disease, and probably the main or one of the major symptoms is coughing. And also, hundreds of millions of people have a chronic cough. What diseases or conditions cause chronic coughing?
Yeah. So first of all, acute cough is, as you say, post-viral, or it could be a new onset of COVID or pneumonia. So we care about that. But 90% of people who have a new cough, it'll go away in 2 weeks and we don't worry about it. But when it persists for longer than that, it becomes chronic cough, then it becomes very problematic for people. And the most common causes, there are three: asthma, gastroesophageal reflux, and postnasal drip. And in many of the cases where they see a healthcare worker, the healthcare worker just spitballs it. They're like, "Oh, you got a cough? Could what is these 3 things? Let's try some Pepsid."
Right.
And the patient goes home and tells their wife, "Hey, I don't know, the doc didn't know what to say. They told me to take some over-the-counter medicine and go away." Right? So, but in many of those cases, it will get a little bit better. Sometimes they'll get a lot better. In many other cases, they got it wrong. They should try something else, like an inhaler for their asthma. So that's a very common condition. And then the third category I would flag is chronic cough, where the cough is actually a symptom of something which is informative. So, for example, in COPD, it turns out that studies have shown that if you measure people's cough 2 days before they recognize they're getting worse and go to an emergency room with an exacerbation, their cough rate goes up. So their cough is a really interesting and important early indicator for remote patient monitoring, because we have so much that we can offer a COPD patient. And yet we have to know when they're getting worse, when they're failing therapy, when they're having an exacerbation. And so by passively monitoring their cough, you can kind of get them to recognize and get them on treatment early before they're in the hospital, intubated, or so severely sick that their underlying pulmonary function declines.
Right. So it's an early indicator that things are getting worse. But as you mentioned, the two words quantify and measure. In the past, there's been no way to really quantify or measure costs. And I think that's why a lot of people just ignored it, as opposed to like checking your temperature or fever, where you have an actual number. So now your company has developed technology, Hive has developed technology, which allows you to actually quantify costs. Can you tell us about that and how it works?
Yeah. But first, I want to flag the very important point that you made, and that is we live in this era of precision health.
Right.
Everything gets measured. You go in to see your doctor, and they measure your height, your weight, your blood pressure. All these things have been measured for years. Now your PO2, and then they say, "Well, why are you here?" And you say, "I have a cough." And in fact, one of the most common reasons people go in to see your doctor is because they have a cough. And it catches them. They're like, "Can't measure that. How is your cough, Robert? How many times did you cough yesterday?" I mean, no one knows. I mean, how many times did you cough yesterday? Right? It's crazy. So yes, in this era of precision health, it is ridiculous that we don't measure the symptom, which is one of the most common reasons people seek healthcare. And that's what drove that's what really was the impetus for Hive. It's like we looked around and we recognized that this amazing technology, the artificial intelligence, which is changing everything, could change the game. And people have been trying to measure cough for 20, 25 years, right? But they've been doing it with like straps that you wear around your chest and it measured your chest movements, or EMGs, or, nasal flow meters. I mean, it was crazy stuff. And in fact, the state of the art right now that's used in FDA submitted clinical trials is they just record. People wear a tape recorder basically, and they listen to it and they count the coughs. I mean, it's so antiquated, right?
Right.
And we just recognize that this is a perfect application of artificial intelligence. And so, small group of us got together and spun up this little startup, and it's been amazing how much we've gotten done.
Right. So tell us how it works. I saw on your website that there's a watch that you wear. It looks similar to an Apple Watch, and then there's an app on your phone. Tell us how that works.
Yeah, so the underlying technology is very simple, and it's based on the same AI that Google uses to find all your photographs that have a dog in it, right? They didn't say like a dog has ears that stick up, whereas cats flop over, or vice versa, or it should be this big or that color. They just took millions of pictures of dogs and non-dogs, and the AI figures it out. That's what we did, right? So we have an algorithm that can recognize the sound of a cough. And we've developed this by collecting over 1 billion explosive cough-like sounds from around the world.
1 billion.
We have sat and listened to and classified them as cough or not tens of millions. An embarrassing large percentage of my life in the last few years has been like going cough, not cough. And then we just feed that into the acoustic AI. And it just says, okay, I can recognize cough, non-cough. So that's the technology. We just listen to sound, but we actually don't even listen to sound. We monitor sound. So it's entirely privacy preserving. When we hear an explosive sound, we grab a half a second, and then that goes through an algorithm. It goes like, oh, that half second's it's too short to know who you are, what you're doing, who you're talking to. But with that half second, we can say that's a cough or not. And then we just timestamp it. So we're like a Fitbit for cough. Every time you cough, we just on the watch recognize it, and then we send that out to your app or a cloud, or record it on the watch. And so that basic technology of timestamping coughs has 3 different instantiations. The first is we have a phone app, and anyone can just Google cough monitoring or Hive or whatever. You'll find your way to Cough Pro. And what Cough Pro does is you download it on your phone. It runs in the background. It counts your coughs. Just that.
So you just keep your phone in your pocket, and the phone hears it when you cough?
Yeah, as long as you're, close to your phone, it gives good data. And, but to be honest and transparent, it doesn't do much when your phone's in the kitchen, as mine is right now, right? So that's second, but it's very helpful because it gives coughers insight into their cough, so they can have a more informed conversation with their healthcare providers.
What does the watch do, though?
So then the watch is actually we've submitted it to the US FDA as a medical device. And what the watch does the same thing, but because it's a watch and not a phone, it's always with you. And you wear it.
It's not in the kitchen when you're in the living room, right?
Yeah, and it's listening even when you're making a phone call. So you wear it during the day, you charge it by your bed at night. It just gives you a very accurate count of your cough, and it tells you when you're coughing. And so that's the second. And the third thing is that we have SDKs which allow our technology to be integrated into consumer apps or other devices. So, there's a company that does step counting for clinical trials. And now you can not only get step counts, but you can also get cough counts. So, and we have a partnership with Meta, these new Polaroid glasses,
Yeah.
cough will be part of the metaverse.
Wow.
So those are the three different ways that simple technology is being played out.
Now, is the Hive Watch actually an Apple Watch, or is it a specific Hive Watch that your company makes?
It's not an Apple Watch. It's a little lighter and a little smaller than an Apple Watch. But when you're wearing it, no one can tell them apart.
Right,
Um,
but it's
it
specific for picking up cough sounds and
Yeah,
counting them.
ours will be a dedicated medical device. So the way I think cough goes in the future is you are cough curious, like your wife's been saying, "Hey, Robert, you've been coughing a lot." And you're like, "Yeah, I don't think I'm coughing that much." And you're like, and she's like, "Download this app." And then she goes like, "Wow, shit, I think I'm coughing 200 times a day." Had no idea. You go see your doctor and you go like, "I'm concerned about this." And the doctor says like, "Okay, let's get serious about it." And then you get the watch and you realize that, wow, I am coughing 200 times a day. And interestingly, I'm coughing after meals.
Hmm.
That really makes your doctor think like that's probably reflux and not asthma. Or maybe I'm just coughing on the weekends when I'm mowing the yard. Maybe that's asthma. So anyhow, so that'll be the medical device. And that's the future, is that cough will be as well monitored and understood as blood glucose.
Right. Now, is this secure, this app, or am I going to get an email from Amazon? You might be interested in buying some cough drops.
No, we're not playing that game. I mean, as a company, there are we well, first of all, we're a science-based company. So we have more than 50 clinical trials that are using our cough because we're
Wow.
scientists and we are blown away by the fund of ignorance about cough. And when you call someone up, Mark Judson, who's world expert on sarcoid, and say, "Hey, Mark, would you like to measure cough in your patients?" He's like, "Yeah." And then he calls you back like a few months later. He goes like, "Oh my God, I had no idea. I give them these steroids and their cough disappears like in 3 days. Who knew?" So that's what we're really focused on at our core, is we're a science-based company. But
Right.
the second thing is that our business model is going to be focused on cough monitoring in research and pharmaceutical trials, and also the use of cough monitoring to improve health outcomes through remote patient monitoring. And yeah, I mean, we probably could spin up some hokey thing where we could sell some ads or something, but that's just not where our heart's at.
Right. So now with a billion coughs that you've monitored or something like that, can you tell the difference between coughs from different causes? For example, if somebody's a smoker, or if they have COVID, if they have asthma, if they have pulmonary fibrosis, cancer, are there different types of coughs, or are all coughs the same?
Well, as a doctor, you can hear a wet cough and a dry cough, and they make you think about different things. And the question is, can acoustic AI get to a higher resolution? Can the computer algorithm hear stuff we don't hear? And I think the short answer to that is we don't know, but we are deep into it. So, we have done a study where we have asked the question, is the sound, looping back to the early part of our conversation, is the sound of a tuberculosis cough unique enough so that it can be diagnosed? So when I was talking about this fantastic new molecular diagnostic, that's not done in the field. Imagine a world, and this is what really got me and many of and two of the founders involved. Imagine a world in which an untrained healthcare worker in a remote African village can ask a patient to cough into the phone, and it says, "Your risk of tuberculosis is high enough that you should make the 4-hour walk to get a chest x-ray." And I think there's a lot of value in that. Now, I will say that between that vision and reality, we've hit a lot of bumps in the road. So we collected 500,000 coughs from 4,000 people who were being evaluated for TB in 7 African and Asian countries. This was funded by the Gates Foundation. And then it's not about us, it's about the field. So we took that data and we put it out on the internet and we said, let data scientists from around the world take a crack. This wasn't about increasing corporate value. This is about, like, we just want to solve a global problem. And take a crack and come up with the best diagnostic algorithm that you can. And dozens of different groups competed with that. And then they submitted their results and then they got judged impartially. And, it was pretty good. It's not a diagnostic test, but it's a good triage mechanism. It'll tell you this is something you should worry about, but it'll never say, oh, this is COVID and not flu. I mean, the biology is indistinguishable. Why should the cough sound different? But it was good enough to be a triage test. And what I most loved about that study is that the group that came in second or third was a high school science club from the Midwest. And I just love that concept of, citizen science. Like, if we push data out there and we let kids, and I don't know, was it Kansas or something? I'm embarrassed to say, I don't remember. They were as good as some of these big tech companies who competed. So 2 things. Yeah, I do think that there is value in the sound of a cough, and it will work its way into clinical medicine. And also, like, how wonderful is the world where, someone like the Gates Foundation can fund this massive data collection and throw it out there and let high school kids kick the butt of these techno oligarchs.
That's great. What about the possibility that you could do epidemiology with this? Like, if everybody's wearing this watch or has this app, and you suddenly notice that everybody in Seattle is coughing, could that be a signal that bird flu is about to become a pandemic? Could it be used for monitoring epidemics or pandemics?
Well, there is no question in my mind that that is true. And very early in our journey as a company, we did a study in Navarra, Spain, and we put the app on a bunch of people's phones and we monitored their cough, and then we actually monitored COVID epidemiology in the community, and we were able to accomplish many things, but we fundamentally didn't get to the saturation that you need in monitoring for that signal to be significant. But I do think that in the coming years, the Hive technology will go from being an app for the cough cure, from a medical device for serious medical conditions, upstream to a cough curious, to actually something that is on every consumer device. It'll be like a step count. So, right now, in my opinion, if you have a cough-related condition, you should have a cough monitor at home, as I have a blood pressure cuff for my hypertension.
Right.
In the future, cough monitoring will be ubiquitous, like step counting, and you'll just pay attention when you can. And once it is on every consumer device, and people are willing to provide anonymous opt-in contribution of data, it will replace a lot of like our highly expensive ER monitoring for flu-like illness. And I think it's going to be a really interesting data stream. And I think we're going to know right away, we're not going to have to sit on the bus and empirically feel like everyone's coughing.
Right.
We're going to get really sensitive, and we're going to know like the baseline. We're going to recognize that, like, yeah, it's January, everyone's cough's up 12%, but this January it's up 17%. That's unusual. And it's up 17% in Seattle, nowhere else in the country.
So it's an early warning signal.
That's my vision.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Now, tell us about some other things. What's a tick cough? Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, I think a tick cough is a kind of controversial decision, but this the diagnosis, but it's also the core of a really new field of cough therapy. It's what I have. As we're talking right now, particularly as I'm talking without, you know, wetting my larynx, I feel this itch in the back of my throat. And I think if I cough, it'll go away. And I also think like, wow, and I should cough because I'm getting all this gunk. Well, that's true if I had COPD, bronchiectasis, but I don't. I have a neural hypersensitivity. And so cough can be a symptom of diseases, but we're learning it can be a disease itself. And this is very common. It's thought that 5% of Americans have this neurogenic cough. And just like a mosquito bite, you think like, that itches, I'll scratch it, it'll go away. No, it gets worse. And that's the same with my cough. I mean, you probably noticed I've been coughing through this whole interview, and the more I cough, like right now, I really want to cough. So the tick cough is just that. It's the thought that coughs are their own worst enemy.
Right. Now, you have something called a behavioral cough suppression therapy for people who have these chronic coughs or neurogenic coughs or tick coughs.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So um, super interesting, bizarrely underappreciated fact that if you have a chronic cough and they can't identify a reason for it, like you have bronchitis or COPD, you probably have this neurogenic, refractory, or unexplained chronic cough. And there are a number of mediators of that. The neural pathways are being sorted out, and drugs are being developed to block those. Merck had a P2X3 inhibitor. FDA didn't think it was good enough. Right now, GSK has one that's in a late phase 3 trial. Fantastic early data, super excited. So there may be, for those of us who have this cough, ways to block the neural pathways. But what's underappreciated is that if you see a trained speech and language pathologist and you spend an hour with them over 4 weeks, that they can explain to you, Peter, that cough, it's not doing anything for you. And the more you cough, the more you cough. And by the way, when you feel that urge, as I'm feeling now, you do simple things like bite your tongue and swallow. It reduces that urge. And the less you cough, the less you'll feel the urge to cough. So this behavioral cough suppression therapy. And what we're super excited about is as a company, we're partnering with a large pharmaceutical company who see the power of this technology to integrate delivering that curriculum remotely over a phone app, integrated with cough monitoring. So, you watch a 1 minute video, the next day there's a little pop-up says, hey, I noticed your cough's getting better. Were you using that thing? Because there are other things we can do. So it's a very interesting thing. And it opens up this field of innovation in healthcare that I think is so interesting, this whole concept of digital therapeutics.
Right.
And a digital therapeutic is very straightforward. And we've all been there. I'm sure you've sat in clinic with patients and you've looked at them and you realize, like, what this person needs is behavior change. But
Right.
all I can do is prescribe a drug. Well, behavioral therapy is going to be prescribable through these digital therapeutics. And we're seeing it in diabetes and insomnia. And the concept is that it's science-based, it's digitally delivered, and it's empirically supported by rigorous evidence. And so that's what we're pursuing now in terms of a digital therapeutic for cough that, in my mind, is either going to compete with the GSK drug, though I guarantee we'll have fewer side effects,
Right.
or complement that drug. because the two together will probably have even more impact.
It's interesting that I think there's a strong psychological component with coughs. For example, about half a year ago, I had one of those horrible colds again, and I had this cough for several months. And whenever I was doing a podcast, I was nervous that I'd start coughing like crazy and disrupt it. But somehow, for that 45 to 60 minutes, I was able to suppress the cough and not think about it. But as soon as I stopped, the cough came back. So I could never figure out why the cough disappears during the video podcast, but then comes back afterwards. So,
Yeah,
so
you were practicing behavioral cough suppression therapy, and for you, it was probably distraction and both awareness that you didn't want to cough. Because when I'm not paying attention, I cough all the time, right? But if I'm going like I can't cough when I'm on a plane, I can decrease my cough. So it's a little bit of you are decreasing, probably consciously avoiding coughing. And all yeah. So that's it. You get your own app there.
yeah, I've got this feedback loop. It's kind of built into my brain. It says, "Hey, you're doing video podcast now. You can't cough, so cut it out." That's
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
Have you promoted Hive and your monitor and the AI and the data to doctors such as pulmonary specialists? I would think every pulmonary or lung doctor would want to have this as a way to monitor their patient, help make a diagnosis, and also as a way to monitor how treatment is working. Also, infectious disease doctors and many internists as well.
When I started working on cough monitoring 4 years ago, I'm like, this is fish in a barrel, right? It's like this is such an obvious thing.
Right.
And 4 years into it, I'm just realizing how hard it is to change physician and provider behavior. And it's sort of the central frustration in my life right now because I totally agree with you, Robert. It's like so obvious. Like everyone who is seeing a patient with COPD should have them download this wellness app and every clinical trial that is looking to improve symptoms that include cough, whether it's a cough medicine or interstitial pulmonary fibrosis, COPD, bronchiectasis, asthma, even congestive heart failure, they should all be including this. It's just complicated. I had no understanding. I mean, I spent my entire life trying my professional life with a blank check, trying to change global tuberculosis practices. And it was a long slog, and it took a decade to do what I thought we should get done in 3 years. So now doing the same thing in the US healthcare system, which is its own form of insanity. It's like, oh yeah, we'll do that, but would we get reimbursed? Well, you could get reimbursed, but you have to meet, it's like, so yeah, no, it's I totally agree with you, and I don't know, how to get people. So what we're doing, to be honest, we're really focused on the patients themselves, and so we have so many users of the wellness app, and it's so gratifying to get this feedback like, oh my God, I went in and I showed my doctor, and for the first time I felt heard. And so I really think that maybe for us the easiest way to change medical practice is to empower the patients themselves.
Right. You can do that now with the internet and social media, but every pulmonary doctor that you get this to can then give it to hundreds of patients. So you can get a exponential growth in the number of people who are using it, but it's tough to get to those doctors, your colleagues.
Well, listen, I'm all ears. So if any of you are out there, just ping me. I'll send you I'll send you whatever we need to make it happen. I'm sure your patients will benefit.
Yeah, well, maybe this next administration will listen and be more interested in prevention and management of disease. We'll see. By the way, you mentioned reimbursement. Is there a charge for people to download the Hive app?
There's a nominal couple of bucks a month to charge that we have, but it shouldn't be an impediment to people getting that.
Right. So that's a pretty minimal cost.
Yeah, and it's the standard thing. It's like, you get a you can get a free trial period, which for us is like we want to make sure that you want it. Uh, and it's easy to cancel. Like I'm so like, I don't know, when I'm on Roku or something, I'm like, oh God, I really want to watch that show, but I bet if I sign up, it's going to take me 2 hours to figure out how to unenroll. I just want to make the promise to anyone who enrolls with Hive, it's easy. You just unenroll because we don't want you if you don't want us.
Right. Yeah. Unenrolling from those things sometimes is hours long
Oh God.
drudgery.
I think it's their business model.
Yeah, of
Having a bunch
course.
of people who can't quit, right? That's not our business model.
Yeah,
What
they
we do
want to keep
is help people.
charging your credit card every month, and then you say, "Oh, I'm just going to give it to them. It's too much trouble to cancel this."
Yeah.
Well, this has been very fascinating and educational for me. I've learned a lot, and I'm hoping that millions and millions of people watch this video podcast episode, and then they'll learn about it. And your servers will be overwhelmed with people who want the Hive cough app.
Well, thanks, Robert. It's so obvious to me that in the future, cough will be monitored and
Yeah.
managed more precisely. And I think I just appreciate your letting us join the podcast because I think this is one way to accelerate that future and alleviate some suffering.
Right. Absolutely. Thanks very much for taking the time to join us today. I really appreciate it.
Good talking with you.